Hey everyone, welcome back to Mountain Road Ride, and today I want to talk to you about spring tune-up on your bike. Now, spring is definitely not in the air just yet. You can see I'm kind of bundled up. Being late February here in the Northern Hemisphere, the weather is still a little on the chilly side, but now is really a good time to start thinking about getting your bike ready for those warmer months. I think if you are thinking about getting a few new components on your bike, now is definitely a good time to put in those orders. There's sort of a general shortage of bike components at this stage, so you might have to factor in that little bit of a time delay should you want to get those new parts on your bike before the warmer weather. Now, it's also a good idea, at least once a year to get your bike fully serviced. So definitely see if you can still get it in at a bike store. Keep in mind that they do get very swamped in the springtime with those spring tune-ups. But that is the purpose of this video. There are a few sort of basic bike maintenance procedures that you could most likely do yourself. If you've got the tools, then you're all set. That's what I'm planning to do in this video. I'm going to fit a few new components to my bike and just breathe some new fresh air into this bike. I think that's a good idea, at least before you head out the door for the first time after the winter, to really do a nice inspection on your bike to see what it needs and where you can maybe improve, especially if you've sort of been sticking it in a back corner and it's full of dust right now all throughout winter, or potentially it's been stuck to an indoor trainer all throughout the cold winter months. Now is a good time to take it outside and get it cleaned up and get it ready for the outdoor riding. Alright, so I'm going to cover with you just a few basic procedures. Feel free to look at the timestamps in this video if you do want to skip ahead, if you kind of feel comfortable with some of the procedures that I'm going to cover today. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to fit a new cassette to this bike. I think this one has had some good use, so I'm going to freshen this one up with a new cassette that I'm going to fit to this bike. Along with that, what I want to do is also just get a new chain on the bike. Even though this one isn't fully worn out, I am thinking of adding a new chain to go along with that cassette, just so that the two start off at the same refresh point. Then I'm also going to just give this bike a bit of a facelift. So from the stock wheel set that you see right now, I'm going to refit my carbon aero wheel set, and along with that goes replacing the brake pads. So this one being aluminum wheels, I am going to now swap it out with the carbon wheels, so that requires a swap of the brake pads as well. Maybe you want to see how that's done, so check out that procedure then. Then as a last step, and this one might be the more advanced procedure we're going to cover today, is to take off the crankset. What I'm actually going to do is I am going to turn this bike into a one-by setup. Now, I'll still cover that procedure in detail in a later video and discuss my rationale behind it, but what we're going to do is we're going to basically take off the crank, replace the current 2 chain rings with just the 1 chain ring, and then while I've got it off, I might as well do a bit of servicing on that bottom bracket. So get some fresh grease on that bottom bracket and on the crank spindle. Just clean it up very nicely. I could even, fix some of the chain sock damage that's been done to this bike and get that all cleaned up before fitting it all together. And then beyond that is just a simple case of also just wiping down the bike and getting it all sparkly and ready for the warmer riding conditions. Alright, so with that, let's get started and dive into the updates that I want to do with this bike and turn it into a summertime ready bike.
You'll need a few tools to be able to complete the maintenance tasks that I'll show in this video. Now, I'm not going to go over every tool in detail, but do check out my 10 tools that every cyclist must have video to see a comprehensive list of tools that might come in handy. Beyond the tools, you might also want to grab some paper towels, grease, some gloves, and even some baby wipes to wipe down and clean the frame. After removing the back wheel, the first step is to remove the old cassette. So first unscrew the quick release skewer, and then take care not to lose the springs as you unscrew the skewer. You might want to take note of how those springs are fitted before you remove them. To complete this task, you'll need a cassette lock ring tool in order to remove the lock ring. So I like to use a 1-inch socket and a standard wrench in combination with that cassette lock ring tool. And then the last piece to this puzzle is a chain whip tool that you'll need in order to hold down that free body when you are loosening the lock ring. Once the lock ring is loose, you'll be able to simply slide off the cassette from the hub. Over on the new set of wheels, it's again just first a case of removing the skewer. Then I also like to do some prep work on the hub by applying some grease to the hub splines. I also like to just apply some anti-seize on the threads of the new cassette lock ring just to make it a little easier to loosen it up in the future. So with that prep work done, it becomes a simple case of fitting the new cassette to the wheel. The last step in the process is then to tighten the lock ring back in place. Now to do so, first tighten it up by hand, ensuring that there's no cross threading, and only then move over to a heavy duty torque wrench, if you've got one, to tighten it up fully. Lastly, it's time to refit the skewers and the springs in the same way that they came out. First job done! Alright, so first it's a good idea to basically just clean up the brake caliper as much as possible, and this is where those wet wipes or baby wipes really come in handy. Next, you want to inspect to see what type of screw is used to secure that brake pad. Now for some weird reason, my bike uses a 2mm hex on the rear brake and then a Phillips head screw on the front brake. Alright, so first you just unscrew that bolt to the point where the brake pad can then just simply slide off of the rail. Then obviously pick the correct right-sided or left-sided pad as the replacement and then just simply slide it into the rails, fastening it up gently. Now definitely just do that gently because there's no need to over tighten the small bolt and they do tend to wear out fairly easily. And then obviously you want to repeat this process on the other remaining brake pads. Alright, so for this next task, we'll start by removing the chain. Now first, I located the master link and then used my chain pliers to break the chain, making it possible to remove it altogether. Right, next it's time to remove the crank, and you'll note that I have Shimano 105 cranks. If you're using a setup that differs, then obviously do your research and learn how to remove and install any other type of crank. For the Shimano compression style cranks like I have, you'll need a tool like the BBT 10.2 to loosen and remove the cap at the end of the crank. Alright, so I started by loosening the crank bolts in an alternating fashion. Now there is a stop plate that needs to be lifted out of the way. For this I could use that BBT 10.2 or maybe even just a flathead screwdriver. And lastly, I could remove the crank cap. And then this allowed me to remove the crank arm altogether. Now you might need a soft mallet to tap out the remaining part of the crank, but do try not to drop that dust cover like I did. I think this shot speaks for itself. The chain suck damage around the crank really doesn't look all that good, and there's a lot of cleanup that can be done, especially around those bottom bracket bearings. So I set out to cover up the scratches as best as possible, but after cleaning off the area well and then reapplying a fresh protective sticker, things still didn't exactly look all that awesome. So I decided I'm going to move on with the rest of the cleaning, and I would return to work on this damaged area a little bit more at a later stage. So the next point of focus was to clean off the bottom bracket bearings. Now this included cleaning the dust seal that fell to the ground earlier. The same applies obviously on the other side and the area around the bearing. Now try not to use some degreaser in this part, and the last thing that you want is to drive out the grease that sits within your bearings. All you really need is just a bit of elbow grease, and that can go a long way to clean up that area. Now I returned to the chain suck damage and I was able to make things look a little bit better. It's obviously still not perfect, but maybe someday I can take it to a frame painter and they can fix it up 100%. Next up was the reinstallation of the cranks. So apply some grease to the spindle, but don't overdo it either. I applied way too much grease and I was left with a big mess that needed to be wiped off as I went along. I used some of that excess at least in the inner part of the bearings. Once you have the crank fully seated back in the frame, ensure that you fit the dust seal on the left hand side and then also lightly grease the threads on that left crank arm before it is installed. Then the last few steps include refitting the cap. Now be careful here not to over tighten it. All you really need to do is put light pressure with your fingers on that tool to tighten it back up. So I wiped off the mess that I made with that extra grease and then I secured the stop plate back in place. After that I checked the side of the crank to ensure the correct torque setting before I proceeded to tighten up the crank bolts. Now again, it's just a case of tightening them up in that alternating fashion. And there we go, another service job done. The last item on the list was to fit a new chain to the bike. Now, since I converted the bike to a 1x setup, the chain length had to be resized. Now, I'm going to link to some Park Tools videos in this case, where you can see how you can size a chain correctly. If you're simply just replacing an old chain, then all you really need to do is match up the new chain's length to the one that you are taking off. So by cutting the chain to size, you will also require a chain breaker tool. Alright, then to wrap up the process, it's a case of running the chain through the derailleur, locking the new master link in place, checking to see if your gears are still shifting correctly, and after wiping off the factory grease, apply some fresh chain lube. Then the last two things that you need to do is just to give that bike a nice full wipe down, and then you get to step back and admire all your hard work.
Alright, there we go. Spring tune-up on my bike done. Hopefully you found this helpful and you picked up a few tips on how to change your own cassette, change a chain, do some bottom bracket servicing, swap out some wheels, and maybe even just change out your brake pads and just generally get the bike looking polished and ready for the warmer outdoor ride. If you did like this video, please be sure to give it a like and do check out some of the other bike related content that we've got on this channel if you need more info. That's it from my side. I am Vian with Mountain Road Ride. Until next time, enjoy your ride.